Chapter 9 29th of March Mykolaiv. Solomia was having an early morning walk through the city. She finally got a day off after working non-stop for 2 weeks. Having to work so much was burning her out internally, and she had no energy on anything else outside of work. Although the last few days she found to be easier and less stressful as she got to spend a lot of time with Zlata. With Zlata making a fast recovery, Solomia felt more positive and more hopeful. She felt that perhaps things were beginning to slowly improve. The weather also bit by bit started getting warmer as the spring was finally arriving. It was still rather dangerous to be outside of home, but Solomia really needed fresh air. After having spent so many hours each day lately inside an overcrowded hospital with stuffy air, she needed to spend some time on her day off to walk around and enjoy the sunshine. There were a few other people on the streets too, though not like on a normal day during a time of peace. Although some people were trying to get on with their lives and feel some sense of normality, many others were still scared and remained indoors. Suddenly, the all too familiar sound of a missile came from the distance. Solomia turned in the direction of the sound, but didn't see anything. A moment later, she heard an explosion somewhere nearby, and she immediately understood that the enemy was bombing the city again. She looked around in a panic to try and get herself to safety of a shelter somewhere, but then she stopped as another thought struck her. The place that just got hit would likely have many people needing help, and her nature was always to help others if it was within her ability. She could not run away and look out only for her own life at a time like this. Every cell in her body was resisting this action, so instead of seeking safety, she began looking for where the missile landed. A few other people on the street were heading in the direction of the explosion, so she followed them. A few more turns around street corners, and she finally saw it. It was the regional administration building. Solomia widened her eyes in shock when she saw what happened to it. An immense see-through hole was made in the middle of the building due to the explosion, as though someone erased a section of the building completely or carved it out with a giant knife. Fires were burning all around the newly made hole, and mountains of debris were formed at the foot of the building. Solomia put her hands to her mouth out of shock, trying to take in the scene, but struggling to accept it. The barbaric nature of this attack was incomprehensible. This was a civilian building. It was not a military base or a storage of military equipment. It was a regular office building for the state administration where ordinary civilians came to work. She continued walking towards the scene. Groups of people were now gathered some distance away from it. There were no rescue services at the scene yet, but they were likely already on the way. "Don't get so close, lady. Some parts of the building are still collapsing," a nearby man warned her. Solomia didn't realize that she was getting quite close to the building, so she took a few steps back as per the man's advice and waited. She was determined to stay at the scene and provide care and help for any wounded, even on her day off. Saving lives was not just a job to her, it was at the core of who she was. 30th of March, somewhere near Kherson. Taras and Roman had everything prepared and ready for execution of their plan. The breakout was going to occur tonight, and there was only one chance to get it right. They, along with every other prisoner, were in the same tiny room where they had been forced to spend most hours of their day. It was nighttime already, and Taras was sure that only a small handful of Russian soldiers were awake in the whole building, and not all of those who were awake were nearby. "Here, you'll need it." Roman handed Taras a small wooden fragment of a broken chair leg. It was only about the size of a grown man's open palm, but it was sharp and useful for close-range attacks. Roman also still had his shard of glass, which he kept himself. "Let's begin," Taras announced to his friend. Roman nodded and signaled to the other prisoners that things were about to get hectic. One of the prisoners, who had a scab-covered injury on one arm after one of the beatings he received from the Russian soldiers, began digging in his wound and making it bleed. When the blood began to flow, he started wiping it on his clothes and then also on his face. Taras edged closer to the only door in the room and knocked on it. The Russian soldiers on the other side weren't always willing to respond to requests from the prisoners. Most times they pitilessly ignored them. However, this night, Taras knew on night watch were two relatively new guys, Petrov and Babanin, and they were likely to respond. Just as he had predicted, a few seconds later the door was unlocked and then swung open. Petrov and Babanin were standing there with rifles at the ready. "You better have a good reason to disturb us in the middle of the night," Petrov said threateningly. "One of us is heavily bleeding. His wound got worse," Taras said and pointed at the prisoner who had wiped blood all over himself a minute ago. The two Russian soldiers switched on the lights in the room and looked carefully at the prisoner Taras was pointing at. "What the hell, man?" Babanin commented out loud. "You need to give him a medical treatment," Taras said. "We'll do whatever the hell we choose to do, so shut your mouth," Petrov silenced him. He then pointed his skinny finger at the bloodied prisoner and said, "You there, come over here." The prisoner listened and began crawling closer to the door. Smears of blood were left all over the floor after him. Just as he reached the door, he fell fully to the floor. Petrov crouched down to take a closer look at the prisoner's wound. This was the moment Taras had been waiting for. Now that Petrov was crouching down next to him, Taras took out the broken fragment of a chair leg and in a swift motion stabbed it in the side of Petrov's neck, bringing an instant death to the Russian soldier. Roman was ready, and once Taras did his move, Roman leapt into the doorway where Babanin was standing and sliced his throat with a glass shard. The Russian soldier did not have the time to realize what had just happened, but he pointed his weapon at Roman and prepared to fire. Roman grabbed the end of the rifle and forced it to point up. A couple of bullets were fired until the enemy soldier collapsed dead from the mortal wound on his throat. "Damn it, the others must have woken up now," Taras said with annoyance. "Then we need to act quickly," Roman uttered and grabbed the fallen soldier's assault rifle. Taras took the rifle of the other soldier and gave a handgun to another prisoner. The prisoners started to quickly exit the room into the main hall, led by Taras and Roman. The lights in the main hall were switched off, but the light in the corridor ahead went on. Taras remembered that the Russian soldiers usually slept in a few rooms down that corridor, so he already knew where they would be coming from. Everyone took hiding spots and cover within the main hallway and waited. They only had a few firing weapons between them, and hence were still outgunned. A few seconds had passed, and Taras could see silhouettes of Russian soldiers coming down the corridor. He aimed with the rifle, waited for them to get a bit closer, and then opened fire. A few of the soldiers were neatly lined up as they were running down the corridor, so he managed to hit several of them at once, killing two within moments. The surviving soldiers returned fire, and a dangerous gunfight began in the building. Within moments, the levels of noise in the building rose up tremendously. Loud gunfire, yelling, glass shattering, and things falling onto the floor. There was chaos, but Russian soldiers remained hidden in the doorways along each side of the corridor, refusing to enter the main hallway and to get themselves exposed. A peculiar sound then came of something metallic bouncing along the floor. Taras peeked out to see what it was and saw with fear in his eyes that it was a grenade. "Take cover!" he growled loudly and hid behind a protrusion in the wall. The grenade exploded with a deafening noise. A few of the prisoners weren't fast enough to move out of its vicinity and got killed either by the explosion or the shrapnel that flew out. Taras got fed up and decided to push on forward. He ran out of cover and sprinted in the direction of the corridor. Once he spotted Russian soldiers preparing to fire, he slid into the nearby cover just in time. Now that he was in a better position, he could take out a few more Russists. And just as he expected, he managed to deliver a few well-placed shots to take out two more soldiers in the corridor. This created an opening, allowing other prisoners to swarm into the corridor and attack the remaining enemy soldiers. A huge scuffle broke out in the corridor, with screams and aggressive yelling. Sprays of blood came from the mass of punching and kicking bodies and landed on the nearby walls. All the hatred the prisoners felt for their captors during these days had boiled over and erupted into frightening acts of violence. All the humiliation they endured only made them more relentless and willing to treat the enemy as nothing more than wild animals that should be put down by any means necessary. When the fighting was over, the corridor looked like a slaughterhouse. Not a single Russian soldier remained alive. A few of the prisoners also perished. Several others were injured. Taras knew the fighting during their breakout would be bloody and violent, but he did not expect the level of carnage that he was looking at in that instant. It was the harshest, most inhumane scene of violence he had ever seen in his life. "We got them all!" Roman walked up to Taras whilst wiping droplets of blood off his face. "How many of ours died?" "Quite a few, unfortunately." Taras asked for everyone to gather in the main hallway and looked around to see who survived. Aside from him and Roman, there were 9 other survivors, which meant that about half of the prisoners had perished in the fighting. Both of the female prisoners were among the fallen too. Taras felt particularly sorry for them, as they had endured the worst humiliation of all during these days. "So, what now?" one of the prisoners asked Taras and Roman. "Before we do anything else, we should first pay respects to our fallen brothers and sisters," Taras expressed out loud, so that everyone could hear him clearly. All of the prisoners agreed. They gathered the dead bodies of the other fallen prisoners in one place. Then they all stood in a circle around their fallen brothers and sisters and slowly got down on one knee. Taras lowered his head and closed his eyes. The others did the same. For a few seconds they maintained silence, thanking those who died for their sacrifice and swearing to not rest until the enemy was beaten in the whole of Ukraine. "Slava Ukraini!" Taras then said, the words meaning glory to Ukraine. "Heroim slava!" everyone responded, meaning glory to the heroes. When they were done, they all searched around the rooms where their captors were spending time for any useful weapons, supplies, and food rations. After that, they headed outside to the front of the building where 3 military cars were located. "Here's what we're going to do from here on," Taras announced. "Our enemy has taken Kherson, but Mykolaiv is still ours. I'd like 2 or 3 of us to deliver a message to those in Mykolaiv. It will be a dangerous journey, however. Any volunteers?" "I'll go," Roman stepped forward. 2 others did too. "What about the rest of us?" asked another prisoner. "The rest of us will go to Kherson. We're going to encourage partisan activities there. No doubt, many of our people are trapped there and would be willing to act to make life of the occupiers more difficult. If anyone is unwilling to do that, please say so now and be gone." There was silence. Every person in their group kept nodding, and it seemed they all shared the same sentiments as Taras. They all wanted to return their city back from the enemy's grasp. Roman then walked over to Taras to get more details of what message to deliver to those in Mykolaiv. "Tell them about the planned partisan activities in Kherson. We're going to try and coordinate it all with them, so that it will be easier for them to retake the city down the line." "Are you sure this will work?" "No, but what else are we to do? We have to fight," Taras said with a hint of melancholy in his voice, and then continued. "Oh, and can I ask you for one more thing?" "Anything." "When you get to Mykolaiv, please find a way to get on a line with my wife, Victoria Shulha, and tell her that I'm alive and fine. I need for her to know that." "It will be done, Taras. I'll make sure of that." "Thank you, Roman. I don't know when I'll see you next, but go safely. You might want to put on some Russian uniforms whilst you're still sneaking through the occupied territories. Take one of the vehicles with you too." "Good idea." "And now, to finalize here," Taras proclaimed and turned towards the building. "We're going to burn it down so that nobody finds out about our escape." 30th of March, Mariupol. Danil and Lera were moving through a destroyed street as carefully as they could, constantly looking around for signs of danger. Every noise was startling them, regardless of whether it sounded close or far away. They were shaken after all these days, but they knew they had to move on for their own survival. The street looked macabre, as though hell itself had absorbed it into its domain. The cars and the trees were on fire, with black plumes of smoke coming. A sickening smell of burnt rubber was emanating from the blazing cars. Even bigger plumes of smoke were coming from the buildings, or what was left of them. Not a single building in the vicinity was untouched. Each one was beaten into a state of infirmity by persistent missile fire that occurred over the last few weeks. The road was full of large dents from the missile impacts and heaps of debris. Some parts of the road were entirely buried under mountains of rubble and remains of the buildings that were smitten from existence. They walked further and could see more devastation everywhere, with each step making them feel that they were venturing deeper into the mouth of hell. Decaying dead bodies were laying scattered all over the road ahead. Many were surrounded by puddles of blood. Torn individual limbs could also be seen left lying in some places, covered in blood and dirt. A couple of disheveled stray dogs with a hollow gaze were feeding on one of the corpses, trying to satiate their hunger. The sight of that made both Daniil and Lara feel sick to their stomachs. "Daniil, are you sure this is the right way? I feel like we're only getting closer to all the fighting," Lara expressed her inner doubts. "Yes, we're almost there," Daniil replied with certainty. "Do you think this guy is trustworthy? He won't just deliver us to the Russians, will he?" "I don't know, but we have to do something to get out of here. If we don't act now, we'll end up just like all these people you'll see here." Daniil had found a man a day earlier who was taking civilians out of Mariupol, and they were meant to meet him in a location close by. Daniil did not know if this would work out, or if it would lead them to more problems. But after being attacked in their shelter, it became clear that sitting quietly in a shelter was no longer a good option for surviving this hell. They understood now that taking a risk and dying on the road was a better option than staying and getting buried in a shelter under mountains of rubble from destroyed buildings. More distant explosions were heard, followed by sounds of tanks firing. Despite how unnerving all these sounds were, Daniil and Lara continued. They barely ate the last 2 days, having to resort mostly to some remains of moldy bread that they had found. They made a turn in the road into a narrow alleyway that was filled with broken glass and pieces of scrap metal, and then from that alleyway they stepped into another street that was in a similar condition as the one before. Up ahead they could see a light grey van and a group of people next to it. "That's the place. He said he'll be by a grey van," Daniil said with a sense of relief. "Why," Lara began, "why are there soldiers there?" Daniil looked closer. The man, Yaroslav, whom they were supposed to meet, was there, but he was in an altercation with 3 Russian soldiers. The soldiers didn't appear to be attacking anyone, but they were demanding something. Daniil moved his right hand behind his back to where he kept a handgun in his trousers. The Russian soldier that he had to kill in self-defense 2 days ago had it on him, and Daniil was now carrying it in case he had to defend his sister or himself again. When they got nearer, they could hear the argument better. The Russian soldiers were trying to stop Yaroslav from evacuating a small group of civilians. "But I've got a permission," Yaroslav was saying to them. "I've been helping to evacuate the civilians for the last 2 weeks. Times have changed. They're not going anywhere, and neither are you," one of the soldiers stated firmly. "Why don't you contact the guys at the checkpoint and they'll tell you?" "We're not contacting anyone. Everyone, out of the van!" There were about a dozen of people crammed inside the van, mainly women and children. They were too scared to exit the van. Nobody trusted the Russian soldiers and wanted to just peacefully leave the city. "I said, out!" the Russian soldier shouted on top of his voice and fired a couple of rounds into the air from his rifle in an attempt to scare the people inside the van to do what he said. Daniil was furious upon seeing this and knew that this was their last chance to escape. He could not allow those degenerates to get in the way, so in a blink of an eye he took out a handgun that he was carrying, directed it at the yelling soldier, and shot him at a point-blank range. A sudden and loud sound from the gunshot made everyone else jump in fear. A burst of blood sprayed from the murdered soldier's head back at the 2 others. Daniil did not wait for a reaction. He then aimed the gun at the next soldier and fired it mercilessly, taking the enemy down within a second. The 3rd soldier was already tackling him when he attempted to aim, and the 2 of them began to wrestle. The soldier was a large and stout man, and Daniil found himself getting pushed back, barely keeping his balance. Lara and Yaroslav tried to grab onto the soldier and pull him back, but with one sharp swing of his arm, he threw them backwards. The gunfire alerted a few other enemy soldiers to their location, who could now be seen coming from down the street. "Lara, get out of here!" Daniil shouted whilst trying his best to overpower the large soldier. "Yaroslav, take her and go!" "Come on, we must go now," Yaroslav told Lara as he helped her up from the ground. "No, I'm not leaving my brother!" "Go!" Daniil yelled as he and the Russian soldier fell onto the ground and continued their fierce fight there. Yaroslav grabbed Lara and pulled her into the van. Daniil was feeling his strength dissipating while the Russian soldier was trying to pin him down on the ground, but he refused to give in until his sister was safely away from this place. The other soldiers were already near and could see what was happening. Daniil heard the engine of the van come on, and it beginning to hastily drive off with a screech of the wheels. When it drove out of sight, Daniil felt a mild sense of relief and stopped resisting. There was no more reason to continue wasting his inner energy. He knew he was about to be caught, and he was ready to accept that. The soldier noticed that and loosened his grip as well, although he continued to pin Daniil to the ground. a group of other Russian soldiers arrived at the scene. "What happened?" one of them asked. "Take this troublemaker away. I think we'll need to teach him some manners." The next thing Daniil saw was a fist rapidly approaching his face and knocking his senses out. Lera was crying and screaming her brother's name whilst at the back of the van as it sped through the ravaged street that was littered with bricks and corpses. She kept looking through the tiny back window even after they cleared the area and Daniil was no longer inside. She could feel her heart getting heavier and heavier with each moment. When reality finally sunk in and she understood that she could not change what just happened, she slumped down to the floor of the van and lay down in a fetal position. She could not think about anything anymore. Her worst fears of losing her brother had just come true. Her mind went numb and she no longer cared what would happen to her. She just wished she would die in peace and escape this pain once and for all. March 31st, outskirts of Kiev. Alexei was sitting at the back of a small truck along with a few other men. They were part of a backup team coming to help out soldiers at the front line. Alexei was very nervous. He was going into an active war zone, and although the enemy was on a retreat in the village he was being sent to, it was still highly dangerous as the Russian forces kept regularly shelling the areas they retreated from. He had to leave Max temporarily in the care of a few very kind people in one of the villages where he was helping out. He knew he won't see Max for a few days. He was getting attached to his new canine friend. With Dmitro not being around anymore, Alexei's main company was Max. He still hadn't the chance to return and check up on Dmitro, neither did he get to check on Maria and Alina after helping them. He wanted for everyone to recover and get better, and for life to return to normal again. He wished this war would end as soon as possible. "We're here," one of the soldiers said as the truck came to a stop. Alexei followed the others as they all jumped out of the truck. A few other trucks were coming in, also filled with soldiers and volunteers. Each one was armed with a rifle. Alexei had a chance to practice shooting a bit in the last few days and was getting better. He was starting to feel more confident in case he needed to shoot at something, but he could still not overpower the general feeling of anxiety, the idea that danger was very close, and that powerful war machines were nearby which could kill him in one shot and leave nothing but a bloodstain behind. "They fled already," the commander of one of the units already present in that village said, "but a few of them that didn't manage to escape in time could still be hiding around the place. I'd like you all to scout the area and make sure it's clear." Alexei was partially relieved. Even though it was still dangerous and some enemy soldiers could be around, at least the bulk of the force was gone from the village and Ukrainian troops had control there. The next few hours were long and tiring. Alexei lost his sense of direction after walking through so many similar-looking streets together with a handful of other soldiers. Many of the streets had mangled and charred corpses of soldiers lying in places. It was evident from fresh puddles of blood and smoking buildings that the fighting there was very recent. Only a few hours ago these corpses were people, and now there was no more life in them. Alexei tried his best not to linger his gaze on any of the dead bodies, as he knew he'd accidentally see something that could haunt him forever. He just made sure to stick with the others in his group and to check the area for signs of enemy soldiers. Over time, they managed to find 2 wounded Russian soldiers who surrendered as soon as they were found. The Russian soldiers were fearful and admitted that they were left behind by their squads as those fled in a hurry from the area. The sense of hurry of the fleeing enemy troops was noticeable also in the fact that they simply abandoned many of their military vehicles. Most of those vehicles were still in a good condition, but were either out of fuel or stuck somewhere in the road. By late afternoon, the area was declared to be secure. Many civilians living in this village were already outside, celebrating the liberation of the village from the notorious Russian world. Alexei saw very touching scenes of how the civilians were greeting the Ukrainian soldiers, hugging them, talking to them, and offering them food that they had at home. They all had to endure living under the occupation of the enemy forces for a whole month, and now they were finally free, and their defenders were here to protect them. Even though the war was not yet over, they were safe now, as the enemy was far away. A few more soldiers arrived later in the day. Some of them had family members in this village whom they had not seen all month because of the enemy occupation. Alexei saw one soldier being very emotional and hugging his mother. Another one was hugging his wife and 2 of his small children with tears in the eyes. relieved that they were unharmed. Seeing all this was beautiful and heartwarming. After so much adversity and so much pain, good things began to happen. Oleksiy wished he would see his family again very soon too. He hoped the war would end quickly and his mother and sister would be back in Kiev again. He missed them greatly. Even despite speaking with them on the phone every day, he missed having them near in person. 31st of March, Zaporizhia. It seemed like a miracle to Lera that they managed to get out of Mariupol. Each time they came across a checkpoint, she expected the worst, but they were allowed through every single time. Now, a day and a half later, they finally made it to Zaporizhia, where Yaroslav used to transport the people before coming back to Mariupol for more. Once they were near a bus stop, everyone began getting out of the van except for Lera. She remained seated against one of the walls, staring into space and lost in her thoughts. All life was drained from her. When everyone left the van, Yaroslav came closer and sat down opposite to her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "I know you're missing your brother and wish he was here." Lera looked up at him, but didn't say anything. Although he was trying to show some care and compassion, his words were barely even scratching the surface of what she was feeling. He continued, "I think you really need some help. You're still a minor, and being all alone is dangerous." "I have nowhere to go," Lera interrupted him. "I have nothing to live for either. My whole family has been taken away from me by those Russists." "You are still too young to be giving up. Here, take this card." He stretched out his hand with the card of a charity organization. "This woman has been helping out people who have lost their families and homes. She lives in Vinnytsia." "Vinnytsia is far away from here. I have no means to get there." Yaroslav looked down and shook his head for a moment, thinking deeply about something. A few moments later he looked up again and began. "Tell you what, I'm not going to go back to Mariupol anymore. It's become too dangerous now, and the city is about to fall. I had a deal with the guys at the checkpoints and paid them bribes to let me through. They were forthcoming as I have a Russian citizenship, so they decided not to bother me too much. But the ones occupying the city center now will be a lot harder to convince. So for your brother's sake, I'll take you to Vinnytsia. Just going to try and get a few more passengers, and we'll set off in a few hours. How does that sound?" "Thank you," Lera said and looked up from the floor at him again. "Okay, good. It's settled then. I understand you're in pain. Mariupol was my home too, even though I was born in Russia. Of my 52 years on this earth, I lived the last 35 years in Mariupol. And now that beautiful city is nothing but a bunch of ruins, destroyed by the people that were supposed to be my own brothers." "They are monsters," Lera stated with hatred in her voice. "I can't see them as human beings anymore for everything they've done to us." "I know, and I understand your feelings about them. I really do. But please don't let this destroy your life. You have to move forward. But anyway, while we're waiting, let's go and get you something to eat. You look very feeble and need to get your strength up.